Did you know that one of the biggest conflicts in history forever changed the global economy and the way the world functions today? World War I wasn't just a battle of weapons. It was an event that reshaped financial systems, brought empires to their knees, and created a new world order. While many view the war merely as a historical milestone, few truly understand its profound impact on the creation of the modern world. Get ready to discover how this conflict influenced your life in ways you never imagined, and why understanding this legacy is crucial for unraveling the mysteries of today's economy. The economic roots of the conflict and the initial impact on Europe. World War I didn't arise merely from political tensions or territorial rivalries. It was also a result of deep economic disputes. The early 20th century was marked by an imperialist race, with European powers striving to dominate colonies rich in resources. These disputes led to commercial rivalries that heightened the tense atmosphere. When the war broke out, Europe faced an extraordinary phenomenon: the sudden halt of international trade. Countries like Germany, whose economy relied on industrial exports, faced immediate challenges. England, on the other hand, saw its financial position threatened, as London was the heart of the global financial system. These early impacts set a historic precedent. A modern war would also be an economically devastating conflict. On the other hand, the naval blockade imposed by the Allies demonstrated how the war would transcend the battlefield. Germany suffered from shortages of food and raw materials, and its population began experiencing strict rationing. The war wasn't just a fight between armies. It was a battle for resources. This scenario also spurred advances in the military industry, a phenomenon that would alter the foundations of industrial production worldwide. The mass production of weapons and ammunition became a pressing need, transforming the civilian economy into a wartime economy. Additionally, the economies of the European powers began taking extraordinary measures to finance the war. Governments turned to both internal and external loans, issuing war bonds. However, this movement had a cost. Inflation began to skyrocket. In France, for example, the price of basic goods doubled within a few years, drastically affecting the purchasing power of the population. The sense of collective sacrifice dominated daily life, but not everyone was impacted equally. While the elites managed to maintain some comfort, workers and peasants faced severe deprivation. Interestingly, the United States, still neutral in the early years, began to emerge as a creditor to European nations. American companies capitalized on the growing demand for products and food, while banks financed loans that would be crucial for the Allies. This marked the beginning of a historic shift in the global economic order. Europe, once dominant, was beginning to depend on American financial power, signaling a dramatic shift in the economic balance post-conflict. Another noteworthy point was the impact on colonies. In India, for example, millions of tons of wheat were exported to support the British war effort, while the local population faced famine crises. In Africa, labor was mobilized on a large scale to extract resources destined for European war industries. These phenomena showed how the conflict reverberated globally, establishing new economic dynamics between metropolises and colonies. However, the human cost was undeniable. The male workforce was largely recruited, leaving fields and factories empty. Women and children entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, deeply altering the social structure. This temporary reorganization had lasting effects, such as the strengthening of feminist movements and the demand for broader labor rights. This first economic impact not only shaped the course of the war, but also planted the seeds for the transformation of the global economy. The balance of power was shifting, and the coming years would bring even deeper changes in how nations interacted economically and politically. It was in this context that signs of a new world order began to emerge. But this is just the beginning of an even more intriguing story. war financing, and the rise of public debt, World War, I presented an extraordinary challenge to the nations involved: how to finance a conflict of unprecedented proportions. The answer to this question led to the creation of a financing model that would mark the global economy for decades. European governments, pressured by the demand for resources, adopted unprecedented strategies, including a significant increase in public debt. In Germany and France, the issuance of war bonds became a common practice, involving both banks and citizens. Entire families invested their savings in these bonds, motivated by the promise that with victory there would be a guaranteed return. However, this gamble had side effects. Galloping inflation was an immediate consequence. In Germany, for example, the cost of living rose so quickly that the German mark lost much of its value during the conflict. This historical phenomenon revealed how wars could destabilize not only the fronts of battle, but also financial markets and domestic economies. While the elites generally managed to protect themselves, the working classes faced extreme difficulties in surviving. In the United States, the scenario was radically different. With its late entry into the war, the country took an advantageous position as a supplier of credit and products. The U.S. government created bonds known as Liberty Bonds, attracting millions of investors, from large entrepreneurs to small farmers. This strategy not only financed its involvement in the conflict, but also established the U.S. as the new global financial powerhouse. This movement marked the beginning of a historic transition in the world's economic center from London to New York, a transformation that would shape the 20th century. Another important aspect was the expansion of currency printing practices. Desperate for resources, governments resorted to creating unbacked money, which exacerbated inflationary problems. This practice also created a sense of insecurity among populations, who saw their savings rapidly devaluing. For the economists of the time, the war became a testing ground for the limits of monetary policies, with results that would echo in the Great Depression years later. Curiously, colonies played a crucial role in financing the conflict. In India, the British government imposed high taxes to subsidize the war costs, draining resources that could have been used for local development. In Africa, entire populations were forced to work under subhuman conditions to extract minerals and other strategic resources. This system of economic exploitation left deep scars, fueling independence movements in the following decades. We cannot overlook the cultural impact of this financial mobilization. The concept of war economy became part of daily life. Government advertisements encouraged moderate consumption, promoted rationing, and asked populations to do their part in the war effort. For many, however, this meant daily sacrifices that only deepened existing social inequalities. The contrast between life in the trenches and the economic struggles of families at home created an environment of growing tension and discontent. War financing was, without a doubt, a turning point. It not only showed how economies could be manipulated in times of crisis, but also exposed the vulnerabilities of the global financial system. However, these changes didn't end with the 1918 armistice. On the contrary, they continued to reverberate, contributing to the economic and social instability that characterized the interwar period. And it is at this point that we begin to observe the devastating impact of Reconstruction, but that's a topic deserving of more in-depth exploration. The economic devastation after the war and Reconstruction efforts. When World War I ended, Europe faced an unprecedented challenge: how to rebuild economies devastated by years of destruction. The numbers were staggering. Countries like France and Belgium, where intense fighting had taken place, had cities, factories, and farmlands in ruins. Germany, defeated, not only faced internal damages, but also sanctions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The scenario was one of economic collapse, with millions unemployed and without access to basic resources. France, for example, had to deal with the reconstruction of its industrial regions in the north, which had been completely destroyed. Additionally, to finance this reconstruction, France turned to external loans, primarily from the United States. However, this dependence created a new layer of economic vulnerability as public debt continued to grow to unprecedented levels. Germany faced an even more extreme situation. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the country was forced to pay exorbitant war reparations. This financial obligation plunged the German economy into a spiral of crisis. The German mark suffered such severe hyperinflation that, in 1923, people used banknotes as wallpaper, and entire families needed wheelbarrows to carry money to the market. This economic devastation fueled a national sense of humiliation, which later contributed to the rise of radical political movements. A notable example of reconstruction was the creation of the Dawes Plan in 1924. This initiative, led by the United States, aimed to restructure Germany's reparation payments and stabilize its economy. American banks provided substantial loans to the German government, allowing for infrastructure rebuilding and industrial revitalization. Although initially successful, this plan created a financial dependency on the U.S., which became problematic during the 1929 crisis. In addition to national economies, reconstruction had global impacts. Colonies, for example, were once again exploited as sources of revenue. In Southeast Asia, colonies like French Indochina increased the export of rice and rubber, while in Africa, the extraction of minerals continued at a fast pace. These practices showed how European powers still viewed their colonies as economic tools, worsening global inequalities that would persist throughout the 20th century. On the other hand, the war also brought technological advancements that helped with reconstruction. The need for innovation during the conflict had accelerated the development of machinery, fertilizers, and industrial methods. This innovation, paradoxical as it may seem, became a crucial tool for restoring agricultural production and industrial capacity in various regions. The same methods used to produce weapons were now being used to manufacture consumer goods, setting the standard for mass production that would shape the modern economy. Socially, reconstruction also required profound adjustments. In England, social assistance programs began to be implemented to help veterans and their families, marking the start of more comprehensive public policies. Labor movements, which had gained strength during the war, pushed for better working conditions and wages, creating a new dynamic between employers and employees. This environment of negotiations and changes reflected the attempt to balance a society deeply shaken by years of conflict. The economic devastation of the post-war period wasn't just a dark chapter in history. It laid the foundation for a new world order. The reconstruction effort brought valuable lessons about resilience, but also exposed the weaknesses of a globally interconnected system. The stage was set for even more significant transformations, and the rise of the United States as an economic power began to define a new chapter in the global power balance. The rise of the United States as a global economic power. World War I solidified a historical and extraordinary phenomenon. The rise of the United States as the world's leading economic power. During the conflict, the U.S. maintained a strategic position of neutrality for almost 3 years, allowing it to supply weapons, food, and supplies to the warring European nations. Disadvantage, combined with an already robust industrial infrastructure, gave the country an influential economic role, transforming New York into the new global financial hub. Before the war, London had been the heart of the international financial system. However, the exorbitant costs of the war caused European powers like England and France to become indebted to the United States. Between 1914 and 1919, American banks lent billions of dollars to finance the Allies' war efforts, creating a direct economic dependency. This transfer of financial power was a historic shift. The dollar began to strengthen, and the American economy entered a prosperity cycle that would culminate in the Roaring Twenties. The industrial growth of the United States was another crucial factor. While Europe was embroiled in battles, American factories were operating at full capacity to meet the demand for military products and consumer goods. Mass production, led by figures like Henry Ford, not only solidified the U.S. as an industrial giant, but also created efficiency methods that would be replicated worldwide. This innovation in production, coupled with control over resources like oil and steel, made Americans leaders in strategic sectors of the global economy. Additionally, the late entry of the United States into the war in 1917 was a calculated move. Although the war generated high costs, the country emerged relatively unscathed compared to European nations. Its cities remained intact, its workforce stayed strong, and its production capacity had not been affected. This gave the U.S. an extraordinary competitive advantage, allowing it to assume the role of global creditor, while Europe struggled to rebuild. Interestingly, the rise of American economic power also brought a new perspective on global power. The United States began adopting more interventionist policies, seeking to protect its financial interests abroad. The Dawes Plan, previously mentioned, was a clear example of this. The loans to Germany not only helped stabilize Europe but also strengthened American influence on the continent. This strategy marked the beginning of a world order where economic interests were as important as military ones. However, this rise was not without challenges. Domestically, the United States faced social and economic tensions. The prosperity generated by the war was not always equitably distributed. Inequality grew, and labor disputes became frequent as workers demanded better wages and working conditions. These movements highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Even in times of great growth, economic stability was often accompanied by social instability. The consolidation of the United States as a global economic power was not an isolated event, but the beginning of an era of American prominence. The global power balance shifted radically, and the repercussions of this new world order would be felt throughout the 20th century. However, the impact of this transition also revealed the first signs of vulnerability in the global financial system, a prelude to what was to come. The collapse of empires and their economic consequences. World War I marked the end of an era and the collapse of great empires that had dominated global politics and economics for centuries. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires succumbed to internal conflicts, revolutions, and external pressures. This fragmentation led to a series of extraordinary economic repercussions that reshaped the political map and the commercial dynamics of the time. New nations emerged, bringing with them the need to create self-sustaining economies amidst chaos. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, created a series of smaller states, such as Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. These countries faced monumental economic challenges. Previously, as part of a centralized empire, they shared markets, infrastructure, and currencies. Now, they needed to establish new borders, monetary systems, and trade networks. This rupture reduced economic efficiency and hindered regional trade, creating external dependencies that made these states vulnerable to global instability. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire had similarly devastating impacts. Territories in the Middle East and North Africa were fragmented and placed under European mandates, such as those of France and England. Local economies were shaped to serve colonial interests, especially in relation to oil exploitation. This restructuring not only drained local resources, but also prevented the sustainable development of these regions' economies. The consequences of this exploitation are still felt today, with many countries struggling to diversify their economies. In Russia, The 1917 revolution and the collapse of the Tsarist regime brought radical changes. Under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, the country adopted a centralized economy that departed from traditional market systems. Nationalizations, land redistribution, and attempts to create an egalitarian society came at a high cost. The civil war that followed plunged the country into economic chaos, with agricultural and industrial production collapsing. However, this transformation would pave the way for the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower in the following decades. Germany's case was also significant. Defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, it lost important territories, such as the Polish Corridor and Alsace-Lorraine, which were vital to its economy. Moreover, the obligation to pay exorbitant war reparations created an economic crisis that led to hyperinflation. This economic collapse not only impacted the daily lives of the German population, but also created political instability that facilitated the rise of Nazism and the preparation for World War II. Another notable impact was the creation of new currencies and financial systems. Newly formed countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia had to introduce their own currencies, facing challenges such as inflation and lack of confidence in the international market. These nations also needed to establish trade relations with larger economies to ensure their survival. This dependence reinforced global economic inequality and strengthened the dominance of the victorious powers. Socially, the collapse of empires exacerbated inequalities and fueled ethnic tensions. New borders, often drawn by external powers, ignored the cultural and linguistic complexities of local populations. This created territorial disputes and economic rivalries that would shape conflicts throughout the 20th century. The political fragmentation also weakened regional cooperation, hindering integrated economic development. The collapse of empires, though devastating in the short term, paved the way for new economic and political models that would continue to evolve. However, the chaos that emerged from these ruins was merely the prelude to an even greater global crisis, one that would soon test the limits of the world's economy. The dependency on war reparations and early signs of a global crisis, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed severe conditions on Germany, making war reparations one of the key pillars of the post-war European economy. Allies, particularly France and England, demanded exorbitant financial compensation to cover the damages caused by the conflict. This decision, although seemingly a logical solution to repair the destruction, had extraordinary economic consequences and created a financial dependency cycle that would shake the global balance. For Germany, the weight of these reparations was devastating. The amount demanded was so high that it exceeded the country's real ability to pay. In a desperate effort to meet the requirements, the German government resorted to printing money, resulting in the hyperinflation that marked the 1920s. This historical phenomenon taught important lessons about the limits of the global economic system. A 100 trillion mark note was no longer enough to buy bread, and trust in the German economy virtually disappeared. The situation was not much better for the countries receiving reparations. France and England, for example, counted on these payments to settle their own war debts, mostly owed to the United States. This created a circular debt system. Germany paid reparations to the Allies, who used these resources to pay off American loans. While the United States thrived as global creditors, European economies became increasingly fragile, trapped in an unsustainable cycle of dependence. The Dawes Plan of 1924 was an attempt to ease the situation. Under this initiative, the United States offered loans to Germany so that it could meet its payments. This approach brought temporary relief, but also exposed the global financial system to new vulnerabilities. When the 1929 crisis erupted, American credit flows ceased, leaving Germany on the brink of economic collapse and triggering a new wave of instability across Europe. Interestingly, war reparations also fueled political resentments. In Germany, the humiliation of being forced to pay an unpayable debt gave rise to fervent nationalism. Political movements like Nazism exploited this discontent, promising to restore the country's pride and economic strength. This scenario became one of the key elements that paved the way for World War II, highlighting the impact of poorly planned economic decisions in times of instability. The impact of reparations was not limited to Europe. Countries in the colonies, whose resources had been exploited during the war, saw their efforts ignored in the post-war period. While European powers used reparations to recover, colonial economies continued to be trapped in exploitation and poverty. This global imbalance reinforced economic inequalities and set the stage for independence movements in the following decades. War reparations, although intended to repair the damages of the conflict, ultimately created an environment of economic fragility that amplified the early signs of a global crisis. The financial collapse that emerged from this situation not only destroyed local economies, but also shook confidence in the international financial system. This context would serve as the prelude to a turbulent decade in which the Great Depression would solidify the failures of an economic model based on debt and dependence. The Great Depression and the economic legacy of World War I was the catalyst for profound economic changes. But it was in the 1930s that its economic legacy reached a critical point. The Great Depression, triggered by the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929, was a global crisis that reflected the vulnerabilities created by the conflict and post-war decisions. The financial ties between the victorious powers, Germany, and the United States formed an interdependent system that collapsed under the pressure of the global recession. Germany was one of the most affected countries, dependent on American loans to finance war reparations. It saw its economy collapse when credit flows were interrupted, companies shut down, unemployment soared, and the population, already weakened by the hyperinflation of the 1920s, plunged into a new crisis. This economic chaos became fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies, with Adolf Hitler promising to restore the country's glory and stability. In the United States, the Great Depression also revealed the weaknesses of the global capitalist system. The prosperity of the 1920s, fueled by mass production and easy credit, gave way to a brutal recession. Millions of Americans lost their jobs and savings, while banks and businesses failed at an alarming rate. The lessons of this extraordinary economic collapse led to historic reforms, such as Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which sought to stabilize the financial system and create social safety nets. In Europe, the crisis intensified social and political resentment. France and England, still struggling to pay off their war debts to the United States, faced popular protests and growing demands for economic reforms. In many cases, governments adopted protectionist policies, such as higher trade tariffs, which only worsened the global economic downturn. This recession underscored how the economic phenomena of the interwar period had irrevocably interconnected the world, but also how these connections could be sources of instability. Colonies, which had already been exploited during the war, felt the impacts of the Great Depression even more acutely. The fall in prices of raw materials, such as rubber and cocoa, devastated economies dependent on exports. In regions like Africa and Asia, this exacerbated poverty and reinforced discontent with colonial powers. These economic challenges planted the seeds for independence movements that would erupt in the following decades, profoundly changing the world order. Despite the chaos, the Great Depression also led to economic innovations. Keynesian economics, proposed by economist John Maynard Keynes, gained prominence by arguing that governments should intervene in the economy to stimulate demand. This idea influenced policies worldwide and helped shape the foundations of the welfare state, aiming to protect citizens from the impacts of future crises. It was an innovative response to an extraordinary problem, and its effects are still felt today. The economic legacy of World War I, combined with the Great Depression, not only altered the global power balance but also reshaped economic and social policies on a global scale. The instability of the interwar period was a historical reminder of how economic decisions can have far-reaching consequences, often unforeseen. However, what was to come in other global conflict would bring an even more radical transformation to the global economic and political landscape. The economic impact of the transition to World War II, World War I, and the Great Depression created a backdrop of economic fragility and political discontent that paved the way for World War II. In Germany, the economic impact of reparations and the global crisis fueled the narrative of injustice and revenge. Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, the country embarked on an economic recovery based on rearmament and large infrastructure projects, such as the construction of highways. This strategy, although successful in providing immediate results, relied on an unsustainable model, increasing debt and preparing for military conflict as a means of boosting the economy. Meanwhile, in Japan, the effects of the Great Depression were devastating. Dependent on the export of silk and other products, Japan saw its revenues plummet. In response, it adopted an expansionist policy to secure access to natural resources. Invading Manchuria in 1931 and consolidating its presence in East Asia, this search for economic self-sufficiency reflected a historic shift in international relations, with powers betting on territorial expansion as a solution to their internal problems. In Italy, Benito Mussolini followed a similar approach, promoting large infrastructure projects and reinforcing the military. The fascist government argued that economic self-sufficiency, or autarky, was essential for the nation's survival. While these efforts generated jobs and mobilized resources, they also led to economic isolation and an increase in public debt, factors that would contribute to Italy's involvement in the next global conflict. In the United States, the initial policy of neutrality reflected the public's weariness with foreign interventions following World War I, however. The American economy began to benefit from the sale of arms and supplies to European nations preparing for war. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 marked a turning point in this process, allowing the United States to provide support to the Allies, while strengthening its own defense industry. This transition demonstrated how the country leveraged its position of neutrality to consolidate its role as a global economic power. England and France faced a complex economic dilemma. Both nations were deeply in debt after World War I and still struggling with the effects of the Great Depression. Yet, they needed to rearm in the face of the growing threats from Germany, Italy, and Japan. This required difficult decisions, such as cutting social programs and raising taxes, which generated internal discontent. Despite their efforts, their economies couldn't keep pace with Germany's rearmament, creating a troubling disparity in the balance of power. A crucial aspect of this transition was the arms race, which stimulated economies across the globe. In Germanic, factories were converted to produce tanks, airplanes, and weapons, employing millions of workers. The same occurred in Japan and Italy, where the military industry became the primary economic driver. This focus on militarism created a cycle of economic growth, sustained by the expectation of imminent war. This period of transition to World War II highlighted how the economic lessons from World War I and the Great Depression were distorted and reused in innovative but risky ways. Rearmament and territorial expansion might bring short-term growth, but they came at the cost of long-lasting peace. The global powers were once again on a collision course, preparing the stage for a new conflict that would not only alter the global economic balance, but also define the course of modern history. The consolidation of a new world order and the foundations of the global economic future with the end of World War II. The world witnessed the consolidation of a new global order, marked by economic reconstruction, the redistribution of global power, and the creation of international institutions designed to prevent future conflicts. However, the foundations for this transformation were laid in the interwar period, where the economic impact of World War I played an influential and lasting role. One of the most extraordinary changes was the definitive shift of economic power from Europe to the United States and the Soviet Union. While Europe emerged, devastated by war, the United States, strengthened by its wartime industry and position as a global creditor, took center stage as the economic and political leader. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, was a strategic tool not only to aid European reconstruction but also to consolidate American influence in the West, marking the beginning of the Cold War. The creation of global institutions such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund (IMF), and the World Bank also reflected lessons learned from the economic mistakes of the interwar period. The IMF, in particular, was created to stabilize national currencies and prevent crises like the hyperinflation that had devastated Germany after World War I. These institutions formed the backbone of an international economic system that sought stability and cooperation, though still under the leadership of the great powers. On the other hand, the collapse of European empires accelerated the process of decolonization, which had profound economic and political implications. Nations in Asia and Africa, long exploited by their colonizers, began to gain independence but faced the challenge of building autonomous economies in a system still largely dominated by their former colonizers. Many of these countries became dependent on loans and international aid, perpetuating economic inequalities rooted in the global conflicts of the 20th century. The Soviet Union emerged as an economic alternative, leading a socialist bloc that rejected the capitalist policies led by the United States. The Soviet planned economy, based on principles of rapid industrialization and state control, sought to offer a distinct solution to the crises of capitalism that had contributed to World War I and the Great Depression. This ideological divide between capitalism and socialism marked the global economic landscape for the decades to come. Key international trade also underwent a historic transformation. The impact of World War I and subsequent crises demonstrated the importance of integrated trade systems. This led to the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), the precursor to the World Trade Organization (WTO). These initiatives aimed to avoid the protectionism that had exacerbated the Great Depression, promoting trade liberalization as a pathway to global economic stability. Moreover, technological advances, driven by wartime efforts, continued to transform economies, from mass production to the use of nuclear energy. Innovations that emerged during the conflicts reshaped economic and industrial growth in the post-war period. Countries that managed to harness these innovations, like the United States and Japan, emerged as leaders in strategic sectors, solidifying their positions in the New World Order. This New World Order, while based on international cooperation, also brought new tensions and challenges. The Cold War arms race, economic inequality between the global North and South, and the environmental impact of intensive industrial growth were direct consequences of the transformations set in motion by the interwar period. However, these changes also presented extraordinary opportunities to redefine the roles of nations in the global system, laying the groundwork for the world we know today. The economic legacy of World War I in the contemporary world, although more than a century has passed since its conclusion, the economic legacy of World War I resonates powerfully in the contemporary world. The events and economic decisions of that period created dynamics that still shape global geopolitics and the financial system today. From the rise of the United States as a dominant power to the creation of global economic institutions, The war acted as a catalyst for changes that defined the pillars of the 20th century and continue to influence the 21st century. One of the most visible legacies is the configuration of the international financial system. The shift from the gold standard to more flexible monetary systems, like Bretton Woods, emerged as a response to the challenges faced during the interwar period. The economic collapse caused by hyperinflation in Germany and the Great Depression highlighted the need for better monetary coordination. Today, institutions like the IMF and World Bank, designed to ensure global stability, still operate under the principles established in the post-war period. The scars of World War I are also reflected in the economic relationships between the global North and South. The exploitative role of colonies during the conflict consolidated economic inequalities that remain evident today. Countries in Africa and Asia, which provided resources and labor, still struggle to overcome the effects of colonial exploitation. These imbalances are visible in contemporary issues such as unequal trade agreements and the economic dependence of many countries on the major powers. The rise of military economics also left its mark on the contemporary world. During World War I, mass military production became a strategic sector, establishing the defense industry as a central component of modern economies. This model persists today, with major powers investing billions of dollars annually in military technology. Military spending, often justified by security concerns, is a direct reflection of the economic mobilization lessons learned during the conflict. Another significant impact is globalization. Paradoxically, the collapse of international trade during World War I underscored the importance of economic interconnectivity. From that point onward, there has been a continuous effort to integrate economies and prevent conflict through trade. Today, the global supply chain system and digital trade are modern evolutions of this ideal, though they face challenges such as protectionism and geopolitical tensions. Additionally, World War I influenced how governments interact with their economies. The concept of a wartime economy where the state takes a central role in mobilizing resources became a recurring practice in times of crisis. This can be observed in contemporary economic responses to global challenges, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments worldwide adopted massive interventions to stabilize their economies. Socially, the changes brought about by the war also remain relevant. The entry of women into the workforce, for example, was an economic necessity during the conflict, but it also paved the way for gender equality movements and labor rights. Today, the impact of this transformation is evident in debates on pay equity and the participation of women in key economic sectors. Ultimately, World War I left us with a historical lesson. The economic costs of a conflict can echo for generations. Today's global economies, while much more robust and interconnected, are not immune to the vulnerabilities that arise during periods of instability. History teaches us that the balance between cooperation and competition is fragile, but essential to avoid the mistakes of the past. Now that you understand how World War I shaped the global economic landscape, the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? The events of a century ago still teach us about the importance of thoughtful decision-making and the dangers of ignoring signs of instability. Consider how these lessons can apply to your life today. Are you prepared to face change and crises? Reflect on this and take the opportunity to dive even deeper into this fascinating world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to keep exploring the incredible impacts of history on our reality.